Due to the fact that we have airplanes to catch, there'll be no further announcements. Our judges are, raise your hand, Miha Andrich from Slovenia, Sandy Berkowitz from Blake, Nicholas Aranda from Regis, Colorado, Shreya Agarwala, USA Debate alum, and Ed Williams from, where are you now?
Pace Academy.
Pace Academy, thank you. All right.
Okay, the motion in front of the House is this House believes that more economically developed countries should provide climate change reparations to less economically developed countries. On the side proposition we have USA gold, on the side opposition we have USA silver. I would that's that. Without any further ado, I would now like to invite the first speaker of the proposition to open the case for the USA Gold.
In the terms of climate change, those who have contributed the least to the problem bear the brunt of the increase. It is the recognition of that single truth today that allows the proposition to stand wholly and want to make sure that the interests of lesser economically developed countries are protected, which is why we are so proud to propose the motion. This House believes that more economically developed countries should provide climate change reparations to less economically developed countries. In this speech, a couple things. First, I'm going to outline our model, then I'm going to go over our burdens, and then I'll move into our two substantive arguments to begin today's debate. First, on the model. Essentially what's going to happen is that more economically developed countries are going to institute a type of tax on consumers that is going to be paid to lesser economically developed countries in lump sums. Now, this is going to be used in two distinct ways. One is to make sure that those lesser economically developed countries have the ability to reinvest in green technology and grow their ability to be more climate change proactive, and B, also make sure that they have the ability to respond to any type of climate change that has already happened in the status quo. As a result, that's going to be our effective model. Next, I'm going to move into the burden. Essentially, the burden of the opposition is to prove that our model is ineffective at reaching the goal of making sure that lesser economically developed countries are at a better point than their model. Next, we're going to move on to the first two substantive arguments. The first of which is that MEDCs are obligated to reimburse LEDCs for the harm that they have caused. Now, first we have to ask the question, when is it that reparations are required? Yes.
Are these lump sums one time or continual?
Continual, based on the tax, because the tax has to be instituted at a point at which they're paid down the line. So continual. Now, we'll move on. Essentially, I asked the question, when are reparations required? We say that reparations are required when an entity has done a specific other entity huge amounts of damage. We say this is uniquely the case because more economically developed countries have contributed to 70% of carbon emissions, meaning that the actions of the more economically developed countries are being perpetuated against the lesser economically developed countries. But uniquely, because climate change is in fact global, you can't limit those harms to the more economically developed countries that have created the problem. Instead, you actually have to move on and realize that it is a larger problem than that. So why are reparations required on the part of MEDCs in the context of climate change? A couple reasons. One, it's because MEDCs are deregulating their own economies. Essentially what's happening in more economically developed countries is that they are opting to have a pro-business stance in which they say, we're going to decrease regulations to make it easier for businesses to operate. What this has created is a dichotomy in which individual countries are supporting, essentially, the use of emissions. That's why they have been continuing to increase. But it is impossible to contain that damage to the singular country. As a result, the reparation is needed. Next, actively harming LDCs continues to happen. That's because more economically developed countries have adopted power structures that tend to exploit lesser economically developed countries. This is because more economically developed countries want to maintain their power maintain the ability to have that type of economic development. Go.
This motion's about climate change. If you were to offer countries green technology that helps them stop climate change, why would you prefer a lump sum?
Okay, so I would say that a lump sum is better for two reasons. One, because yes, you can invest in that green technology, but two, you also have the ability to recover from some of the damages that have already been done by climate change. Because as we know, in the status quo, there have already been these type of areas that have had extreme causes, but uniquely in our world, we create the ability with the lump sum because that money is autonomous and can go into wherever the country specifically needs it the most. We'll get into a little debate about why it's better to have that type in a second. Now, the final reason why it is better to have these MEDCs and why it's justified is because we are creating economic troubles on behalf of the LEDCs through the combination of political exclusion. That's because essentially what is going on in the status quo is that more economically developed countries are getting together, making economic policy that systematically excludes lesser economically developed countries. This has created a lack of infrastructure. This is manifested in the type of colonialization in which there isn't the type of individual action there isn't this type of action that allows MEDCs to continue to help the LEDCs in this way. Now, we have to say why the lump sums are going to be both direct and proportional. The reason for this directness specifically is because when you give an allotted sum directly to a country, they get to decide how their country best is able to use it. Now, why exactly are these lump sums proportional? That's because we recognize that the main reason why LEDCs find themselves in bad situations is because it is proportional to the damages that have been caused by MEDCs. So note that this argument functions independently of any practical aspects, because on a principle level, if a country or an MEDC has done a lower income developing country any amount of harm, it is their job to provide reparations to those countries. Because we have proven that, we've outlined our principle level. Next, I'm going to move on to the practical level, which is our second substantive argument, which we say we're helping LDCs with worsening climate, because they have worsening climate change issues. The first substantive argument is that we're going to combat climate change more effectively in our house. That's because Haiti, Indonesia, and other countries of similar areas have already seen the effects of climate change. Right now, what they have, in order to protect themselves from increasing floodwaters, you need to provide a certain type of infrastructure that is specifically available when you have the lump sum amounts. That's because you need to build types of dikes, you need to build types of barriers, and you need to build types of ways to keep the water out. This is different uniquely than what An just asked in the earlier point, because uniquely, the green type of technology isn't going to provide that same ability and that same autonomy to spend money as we wish. Next, we're going to move on to how reparations are actually going to include instruction and assistance. Part of reparations is the fact that if you are giving money to a different country, you're also going to be working with that country to see where exactly the money goes and how it's used. That's why our model is going to continue to be effective, because we solve for that political illness that happens when countries aren't working together. But by providing this reparations, we're going to see the positive benefits. Now, there are 4 unique effective uses for these type of benefits. Now, I'm going to talk about Jakarta, and specifically how Jakarta has invested in infrastructure and has actually provided a better way to combat climate change. Because understand, if you want to make sure that lower economically developed countries can invest in climate change, you have to make sure that they have the infrastructure that is ready to do that. That is only possible in our world in which we provide the lump sum to create that infrastructure. Next, we say that reparations are meant to empower people, because uniquely, if you are given reparations in an area for harm, you're necessarily going to make sure that individuals within that country are given reparations in type, and that those reparations are helping citizens. That is distinctly different than just investing in green technology, because they have to help people individually. Next, we're saying that reparations are going to help countries' economies, because essentially, when you give individuals a larger area to both improve infrastructure, which has a 2 times spending multiplier, and when you make sure that that infrastructure is going into green technology as well, you're going to create that better type of economy that's stronger. Finally, we're going to empower refugees, because we're helping those displaced when you create the infrastructure needed through those lump sums and allow countries to do it on their own. We are so proud to propose.
I thank the speaker for her fine speech, and now invite the first speaker of the opposition to open the debate for Team USA Silver.
question that climate change is a major problem against the world. But I don't believe that throwing money at a problem is the same thing as solving it. That's why I'm so proud to oppose. Over the course of this speech, I'll be doing a few things. The first of these is clarifying the framing of the round. Second, I'll be going and addressing side propositions arguments. And third and finally, I'll be posing the first two of the three substantive arguments on side opposition. But first, let's go forward to clarifying the framework. First of all, I'd like to point out a flaw within the propositions framework. They assert that the tax would be paid by consumers. We on side opposition would assert that this is harming these people in two ways. First of all, the people who are responsible for emissions aren't necessarily consumers, but rather corporate businesses. In fact, we find that 90% of the emissions are done in the world are by just 50 companies. When you hurt consumers for this, A, you hurt them because their world is literally going underneath water, but B, you hurt them because you're using their money to fund a tax to solve for a problem that they didn't create. With that in mind, we have a counter model to propose. We have proposed that instead of more economically developing countries giving money to less economically developed countries, they would instead use that same money to both invest in green technology and use it to resettle refugees who were displaced by climate change. With that, let's go on to addressing their case, starting with their first point. But first, I'll take a point.
So you're giving money to individuals who were hurt by climate change and then keeping your green technology to yourself. That's your model?
That's not the model at all. The model is A, investments within technology, but B, funds that specifically go towards refugees. This is contrary to your model because as you assert a number of times in your case, you go with no strings attached. With that in mind, let's go into your first substantive argument, the obligations. First of all, the obligations aren't reciprocal. If the problem with climate change is the fact that the climate is changing, the way that we address for that is by reducing climate change, not by throwing money at the problem. Already, we see that there's principally not a match in this case. But second, let's go forward onto some of the more minute points, starting with subpoint A, which is deregulation. We would contend that deregulation is problematic just because the status quo of industries happen to be that they burn fossil fuels or coals because those are cheaper. The only way to solve this problem from happening is by investing within green technology, and let me explain to you why that's best done on side opposition. Because the vast majority of innovation when it comes to green technology is happening in these more economically developed countries and then exported to these less economically developed nations. There's no way to fiat that all of these nations with solar economies are just magically able to create arrays of solar panels or whatever. Instead, the role of more economically developed countries is leveraging their economics to establish this technology and then give it up. Second, we also propose on the third subpoint of exclusion that the solution is less exclusion, not money. Once again, if you want to address for a flaw that is the lack of representation on the global stage, the solution isn't saying, here's $1 trillion, be done with it. The solution is making sure that they can actually express their own views. Next, let's talk about this direct and proportional argument. First of all, we can't use this argument because the proportion is reducing climate change, not money. Next, let's go into their second substantive argument, which talks about the worsening effects of climate change. Let's start with a major contradiction on this. They start off their entire case by saying the vast majority of emissions come from more economically developed countries. Then they pretend that if they give this money to less economically developed nations, they will magically solve the problem. The contradiction here is that you are giving resources to people who aren't responsible for the problem. That means that they just don't solve. The second concession that they make is a fundamental contradiction in how they'll use the money. In the beginning of her case, Cassandra asserts that this money is with no strings attached. But later on in her second point, she asserts that the only way to ensure that these funds are used properly is some guidance to make sure that these funds are allocated well. With this contradiction in the model, I don't understand if we can go further on debate. There's no reason that, under her own admission, there's no reason that these lump sums are the best way of solving the problem. With that in mind, I'll take a point, if there is one. Alright, in that case, we're going to go on to the opposition case, starting with the first argument, the principle, that climate change reparations decrease accountability.
Point?
Yes.
If you're giving money to refugees of people affected by the climate, are you not paying reparations to these individuals?
There's two fundamental differences in our model. One is the fact that we assert how the money is going to be used. Two is the fact that we ensure that green tech investment will happen in more economically developed countries and later be exported, rather than giving money to people who aren't able to solve the problem. With that in mind, onto the first sub, we have to understand that the more economically developed countries are responsible for over 75% of climate change emissions. And making them give money to less economically developed nations would erase accountability in a few ways. First of all, no matter how strenuous they are, they're unjustified. That's because according to a study conducted by Oxfam, the cost of climate change for less economically developed countries by the year 2050 is going to be over $1.7 trillion. Countries like Ethiopia are going to die out in drought. Countries like the Philippines are going to go entirely underwater. And there is no sum of money that can compensate for that. Therefore, there is no proportionality. It's effectively giving someone a small fine for committing a murder. The real obligation that we have is to address climate change at the root. But second, we have to understand that the other thing is the trade-off with accountability. If we need to solve the problem at the root, giving money to these nations will only delay that solution because these more economically developed nations feel like they have already fulfilled their burden. There is a direct trade-off in political and economic capital just because there is a limited amount of money in the world. Insofar as we prove to you that we are more effective at solving the problem, that means that you're going to vote for the proposition. And third and finally, we have to understand why their approach is entirely ineffective. That's because when you go to these less economically developed nations, a lot of them don't even have the baseline level of technology required to manufacture green energy on a large basis. They don't have the infrastructure capabilities to build wind turbines, they don't have the capabilities or capital to build major dams, and they don't have the manufacturing capabilities to put a bunch of solar panels out. That means you're giving money to someone who doesn't solve the problem, who's likely going to use it for just more problematic things that will ultimately contribute to climate change. On to the second substantive argument. The second substantive argument that we're going to go over is talking about how climate change is more effective when addressed through green technology investment within the United States of America or other more economically developed nations. This is for a few reasons. Subpoint A is going to be just the fact that it is easier to invest in nations where a baseline level of technology already exists. This is predicated on a few layers. The first of which is more economically developed countries have more emissions, and they have more of the companies that are causing emissions. Remember the statistics that I gave you. If only 50 companies account for over 90% of emissions, what that means is that we have to solve in the countries where those companies exist. That doesn't happen over on the opposite, or rather on the proposition world. The second thing that we have to understand is within the opposition world, because we can more effectively use capital in places where, it's needed, because we have the capability of understanding and directing where it goes to, unlike the proposition model where they just give money to solve a problem. We can also ensure that the effects against climate change are more direct. Understand that a big problem with a lot of these less economically developed nations is ineffectual governance or the inability to allocate funds as effectively as they do in more economically developed countries. Unless these things are rectified, any money that goes to less economically developed countries will not be as effective in solving the root of the problem. Therefore, if you want to actually solve for climate change, which is the ultimate goal of everyone in this debate, the only solution is a ballot for the opposition. In conclusion, what we have to look at today is both on the principle layer and on the practical layer. Reparations are an atrocious idea. Not only do they not account for our responsibility, they also ensure that the problem will only further proliferate. Proud to oppose.
I thank speaker for his fine speech. Now I invite the second speaker to continue to recite proposition.
The opposition case becomes contradictory when the first speaker tells you that reparations are a terrible idea, but simultaneously tells you that the refugees whose lives have been torn apart by climate change should get paid reparations so that they can be reintegrated into society. The only benefit that the opposition thinks they're garnering at this point is an increase in development in green technology. That was an explanation that we told you in our first speech was going to be much more massive on our side of the house. The proposition is far ahead. Two questions to summarize this round so far before diving into the third substantive argument. First, are reparations justified? And second, how are these reparations going to work? But first, a clarification on framing. Yeah, we told you that these reparations were going to be conditional. That wasn't contradictory, it was clarified in framework. But second, we think that both corporations and corporate owners are going to be taxed in these consumer taxes in the same way. That's how taxes work. Are reparations justified? Yes. Why? Take some of Aram's analysis and use it against him, right? He tells you that these developed nations produce the large majority of these climate emissions in the first place. So, for instance, since 1850, the United States has quite literally produced more carbon emissions than any other country in the world. The only country that comes in second place, or should I say group of countries, is the entire European Union. What do these have in common? First world countries who have produced these carbon emissions. They're the actor we need to hold accountable. So their push on this is basically just, we shouldn't be impacting consumers. 3 responses here. First of all, we say consumers are partly responsible. But even if you don't buy, that's the main criteria we should be looking at. Second, we tell you that corporations are always going to be taxed, and big corporate owners are going to be taxed more because that's how tax brackets work. And third, consumers probably won't want to pay the tax. The opposition is completely correct, but they put financial pressure on the corporations to change the kind of materials those corporations are producing in the first place. We think that's how we get to actual change within the corporations, because these corporate owners know that they're not going to make a profit if they're only creating materials that are counterproductive to solve climate change. Second question, how are these reparations going to be used? We told you they were going to be used in one of 2 ways. Either they're going to be used to invest in green technology or to mitigate the impacts of climate change. Arnold tells you, well, these countries can't produce green technology because they don't have the money to. The great thing is, we're giving them the money to on the proposition. Why are they not doing it in the status quo? There is a huge lump sum that you have to pay when you originally start investing in green tech. This looks like you're having to pay over $1,700 for green technology, per gigawatt of green technology, compared to less than $1,000 for something like coal to produce the same amount of power. However, once you have that initial investment, it becomes much cheaper for these countries to produce green technology. Yeah, we recognize they don't have the resources to do that in the status quo. The difference is when they have the money to, they're always going to have the incentive to invest it in green technology. The second way in which they're going to use this money is through mitigating effects. This looks like building dikes to protect land or investing in drought-resistant seeds. This is important because then things like the agricultural economies within these nations are going to be preserved. Why will LEDCs use this money more correctly than MEDCs? 2 main things here. First of all, they have the incentive to maintain economic stability. This is really important in scenarios where a lot of these LEDCs are heavily dependent on their agriculture industry. That means when we have the adverse effects of climate change, like long-term droughts, the agriculture industry falls apart with the rest of the economy. Before I move on to my second reason, go.
Your plan takes money away from MEDCs. You tell us that those create the vast majority of pollution in the status quo. How then does your world ever decrease pollution coming from those MEDCs if you take money from them and they solve climate change?
Sure. So in the status quo, it's quite obvious that MEDCs just don't have the incentive to try and combat climate change because they reap the immediate benefits of just using things like coal and oil. It's cheaper for them and they get to produce more money. I'm going into explicit analysis in my third substantive argument why this changes the incentive for MEDCs to actually switch, meaning that, notably, we garner all of the offense that the opposition tries to play. But the second main reason that LEDCs are going to use this money more effectively than MEDCs is that they recognize that if the stability falls away within their country, even corrupt politicians are going to lose all power. For instance, in the most extreme example, if an island quite literally goes underwater because of the impacts of climate change, then that politician doesn't have any power over his or her country anymore. To that point, we think that we should be evaluating which country is going to be more likely to use this money in the correct way. Our third substantive argument explains why it's always going to be LEDCs. So our third sub is helping the global community. We think that reparations serve as a direct accountability to measure the incentives of MEDCs to be eco-friendly. First, it's important to understand that the global community lacks swiftness and action that climate change necessitates, especially in developed countries. Why is that the case? 3 things. First, developed countries often thrive on the environmentally harmful technology industries, so they're reluctant to come back on them. Second, developing countries disproportionately don't face the impacts of a warming world. Developed countries aren't going to see the immediate impact because they're not at risk of, for instance, going underwater or having huge impacts on their agriculture industry because they're not holistically dependent on it. They're much more likely to be dependent on something like the oil industry. Third, climate change worst impacts are likely to come in a few centuries or at least a century, so they lack the urgency because they don't see a direct incentive to invest in anti-climate technology right now. The impact is that MEDCs are always going to be slow to respond. 80% of Americans think that climate change is a major problem that needs to be dealt with, but less than 28% would donate $1 a month to actually combat this climate change. Why? It's too inconvenient. Our model forces them to pay. Since they don't want to spend money, they'll try to become more eco-friendly to minimize these reparations. Why would they find mitigation on efforts preferable? We think that reparations are going to be this reoccurring expense that won't go away without action. Second, mitigation efforts would allow them to escape reciprocity. But third, green technology investment means that they get to have a profit, meaning that they don't have to send all of that money to somewhere else. Recognize, even if you acknowledge that METCs are actors that solely want to make profit for themselves, they have the incentive to invest in green technology because this means that they can make a profit for themselves. And then finally, this forces METCs to take responsibility and action. Currently, global coalitions are flawed, meaning that no one can come to an organization in which people are collectively persuaded to combat climate change in the status quo. We think the most powerful countries, when we look at international institutions, are also going to be the biggest contributors to climate change. Second, these smaller countries lack the set of resources to create the feuds that would actually take action against fighting climate change. Reparations give developing countries an increased amount of leverage. 3 reasons here. First of all, now they have the resources to do things like invest in green technology. Second, they certify their commitment to the environment, legitimizing their stance. And third, they hold METCs to the moral obligation of combating climate change in the first place. Note, coming out of the opposition one, the only unique benefit they garnered was having the development of green technology with METCs. I successfully explained to you why that is likely to happen in the proposition, because they are trying to combat these adverse effects of climate change on either side of the house. However, we recognize there is a justification to giving the reparations to the countries we destroyed so proud to propose.
I thank the speaker for her fine speech, and I invite the second speaker to continue for opposition. Stage is yours.
We think that side proposition has lost this debate from the get-go for the simple reason that their model is literally contradictory to their principle of reparations. Let's explain what reparations are just to clear this very, very messy debate up already. Reparations are an apologetic gesture to say that we are sorry for the bad things that we've done to you, and then to give you this type of money to show some type of compensation. It is not to necessarily fix the issues that you have already inflicted upon them, but rather a gesture to show that you are sorry and compensating for the things that you have done. An analogy would be, if somebody breaks your window, they can either give you money or they can fix the window for you. On their side of the house, they're giving them the money. Therefore, this means that they also have to defend the owner of that window, spending it on whatever they want to, rather it be another chair or another table, not necessarily have to spend it on the fixing of the window. Cassandra literally says in her first speech herself that the differentiation between our model and their model is that on their side of the house, they give these nations freedom and don't actually boss them around into what they actually want to do. However, the problem is that she then says that under their model, they would also actually oversee this type of privilege and see what they want to do with this money and guide them in the right way with green technology. We think that's inherently disingenuous on their side when this reparation as a lump sum is supposed to be compensation and allowing them to do what they want with the money and pretending that they are, but then actually guiding them to invest in green technology and such. We don't think they can defend such a thing. We think that they have to defend the worst case scenarios in which these corrupt leaders or leaders of these nations have to spend this money on other things. Our model is a model in which we go in and fix that window directly. We invest in green tech ourselves. We give them the tech that they need instead of giving them the money and then having them develop infrastructure, etc., based on their choices. That's the distinction. We think ours is much better. Now let's touch on the issues about whether or not LEDCs will actually spend their money on the right things. On their side of the house, they talk about these corrupt leaders wanting to protect their power by not letting their island sink. But recognize that the reason why corrupt leaders even have power is because they're able to actually sustain short-term benefits to their citizens to actually prevent a revolution, etc. This means that the only way they're able to actually maintain their legitimacy is to provide people with economic benefits and basic living standards and such. That is why, under these type of circumstances in which they get a lump sum, we think they're more likely to spend incentive on giving the people food, giving the people electricity, public housing, etc., other than preventing their sinking island from continuing to sink. Because in their minds, and the citizens' minds, it's probably a very, very far issue into the future, and in order to maintain legitimacy, we think they're more likely to spend it on short-term goods for the people just to keep them down and not to have them revolt, etc. In addition, even if these LEDCs were to actually invest into green energy, we don't think that they would make these decisions for the simple reason that it takes a very long time to halt climate change, right? It's not just that these LEDCs invest in green energy and suddenly everything is fine and their island stops sinking. Without the entire world on board, we don't think the decisions they'll make to waste their money on something so long-term and likely not going to halt their sinking island, instead of just spending it on more material goods that we will see the benefits from very, very quickly. We think that on our side of the house, it's much more likely that we'll actually be able to halt the effects of climate change when we directly give them green tech and allow them to use it. But also realize that a part of our model is also about investing in green technology as MEDCs ourselves. That is to say, on our side of the house, there's a binding agreement in which we actually fix the things going on in the MEDCs as well. But on their side of the house, they don't do this because MEDCs become very complacent, thinking that they've played their role in climate change already, paying this type of reparation, and have no incentives to actually invest in green technologies themselves. So even if on their best case scenario, at the highest ground, these LEDCs spend it to try to improve the environment, without the MEDCs on board and any type of incentive, we don't think that it'll actually follow through and change anything. But now let's go on to their third substantive about MEDCs. They say that MEDCs will have an incentive to invest in green tech better on their side of the house. However, realize that's not true because the warrants they give for this argument don't actually make sense. They talk about how they can also profit from green tech and how in the future there will be more growth, etc. We don't think that's necessarily true because these MEDCs can shrug off these type of reparations very easily, right? We don't necessarily think it's a huge damage to them so long as they're still a big, powerful country. And if they are profiting from oil, if they are profiting from dirty practices, even better, we don't think there's incentive for them to actually change their ways. On our side of the house, we force them to. We think it's more effective under our side. I'll take a point. Okay. Now we will go on to the point about these LEDCs having more leverage. Their main warrant for this type of argument is that suddenly these LEDCs will prove their legitimacy and be on board with climate change, etc. We don't think that's actually true, given that Arham has told you that they won't have the necessary resources to actually invest in this type of green energy and make it work with the legitimacy that they're providing. We think that under their side of the house, what's likely to happen is that these MEDCs are going to give lump sums of money to LEDCs, and they won't have enough incentive or more money to actually get the entire infrastructure started up. You can't just buy a couple of windmills and solar panels and expect everything to work out. There's a lot of infrastructure that needs to be developed. We think that under our side of the house, we help them directly develop that infrastructure. We don't think a lump sum of money is enough, considering you're not supporting them throughout the process with human resources, intelligence, knowledge, etc., to actually set up power grids and things like that, things of that sort. So we think on their side of the house, they're just giving them a lump sum of money, not really telling them what to do with it, teaching them what to do with it, and actually solving the issue in general. Sure.
You're simultaneously critiquing us for the aid being conditional and then telling us the reparations won't work without conditionality. At this point, you've put yourself in a double bind.
No, the point is, on our side, we need condition. On the top of my speech, I told you why on your side of the house, you cannot defend conditional reparations, because that is not what reparations even are. Reparations is a gesture showing that you're sorry for apologizing, etc., right? We think on their side of the house, they have to defend these LEDCs using the money in whatever way they want because they have been wronged and now they can fix it in their unique ways, whatever they want, feeling how they feel, right? On their side of the house, we think it's disingenuous for them to say that this is a reparation, but then tell them how to use their money. We don't think that's what reparations are for, and different countries have different needs. Therefore, on their side of the house, it's not actually a reparation. You're not giving them the freedom to spend it the way they want. That's the distinction between our models. On our side of the house, we support conditionality. We're not saying sorry, but we're saying that we want to help you fix this issue. That is why it's much better principally on our side as well. But now onto our third substantive argument about backlash and unjust punishment on the people. We think that this will likely stunt future growth in green tech and actually disincentivize governments to run on a green platform. That is because on their model, you are actually taking consumer money. However, we don't think it's consumers' fault for actually supporting these big corporations, considering the capitalistic behaviors that have conditioned consumers into this type of toxic consumer culture. There's no other choice but to succumb to these big corporations because it's the easiest way of life and often the cheapest. It's not very cheap to buy metal straws and continue living green. The most available and the best way for citizens to live comfortably is to succumb to these big oil companies and stuff. If we see in examples of France, when they tried to increase the price of and tax things like petrol, people went out on the street and protested against it. We think this backlash is something that we don't want because then it actually stunts the growth that we could have had in the future when the government is trying to improve their green energy, etc., but the people actually don't want it because it feels like they're taking away. We think this creates a very bad narrative around green energy in general, and we think that in the future on their house, the people simply won't be in support and no policies actually go through after this lump sum payment, and that is why we're very proud to oppose.
I thank the speaker, and I invite the third speaker to continue for proposition.
For centuries, developed countries have allowed climate change to run rampant. They have pursued profit over pollution, ignored the cries of reason and science, and have stamped out the voices of the developing world. We on side proposition are the only side that stands for accountability. You vote prop. I'm going to be doing a couple of things in this speech. I'm going to ask two questions to frame this round. First, on are reparations principally justified? Second, on what are the pragmatic effects? But before that, I'm going to take down their third substantive. Because opposition said basically that consumers are unfairly taxed. They're not the right actors to be able to take these money from. 4 reasons why that's wrong. First, we say that corporations are also paying taxes, right? Businesses aren't running around in these developed countries not paying any form of tax. Second, businesses don't exist in a vacuum. In a market, businesses exist solely for the demand of consumers. That is to say, the consumers caused the climate change in the first place because they demanded things such as fossil fuels, natural gas, coal. Third, governments also don't exist in a vacuum, especially in the developed world. Why? Voters are the ones who vote in the government and politicians who are supposed to be fighting climate change, who are supposed to be regulating these companies. At the point in which voters have failed to vote in politicians that actually do good change and have actually harmed these developing countries, then they are the actor that also needs to be taxed. And finally, even if we accept some degree of coercion, for example, corporate lobbying, these consumers have still indirectly profited off these corporates going on. So even if they didn't know that this was happening and they couldn't do anything about it, simply by the fact that they got economic profit that increased the quality of their lives at the expense of the developing countries, that we think that they do need to be punished, that they do need to be give money to benefit the quality of life in these developing countries. First question, who wins on principle? We told you that reparations are required when an actor has dealt extreme damage and has repressed the other actor. We gave you 4 words. First, developed countries have deregulated their economies. Second, they have actively harmed lower developed countries. Third, they cause economic desperation through colonization. Fourth, through political exclusion. We heard 3 responses from side opposition. The first was on practical effects. Like, come on, this is a principle. You can't really respond to a principle with practical effects. I'll address that in my second question. Second, we just heard that reparations have to be lump sums. I'm sorry, but you're not going to back us into a corner where these countries can do whatever they want. Because we think reparations are going to the citizens, right? At the point in which you're making sure reparations are going directly to the citizens by regulating the governments, we think reparations are then fair to the citizens and actively working against those harms. Even if you don't believe that, I'm going to give you incentive analysis to why developing countries will use it for good. Third, this was their majority of the first substantive. They basically said reparations weren't enough. 2 responses here. First, I'm not mischaracterizing the argument. They literally just said that it's going to cause $1.7 trillion of damage in 2050. And because we're not going to have enough money, suddenly these reparations are going to be unjustified. Think about the comparative here. They're giving literally $0 in reparations. They can't say our side is suddenly super unjustified because they're giving 0 and we're giving a lot more. But second, we do think we'll be able to be proportionate, right? Let's do some calculations here. The US GDP is more than $19 trillion. Europe is right under 19 trillion. But doing some quick math, that's $38 trillion. I'm pretty sure by 2050, you can raise enough funds to actually get these reparations. Why is this principle so important? It's like saying the owners of slaves, I'm going to do my best to free you, but I don't have any need to actually give you reparations because I'm doing something good inherently, although I did the action that was bad in the first place. What do we stand for? Reparations are inherently needed. Even if you don't believe that, I'm about to show you why we win on pragmatics.
Point.
Before I move on, I'll take the point.
Who do you force to reparate whenever you're going to give reparations to slaves? The slavers or the people who sat back and watched?
We think that both should be given reparations because they did nothing to actively do the hooks. Of course, we think responsibility falls more on the owners, but it's by the fact that bystanders just stood by while the harms were being committed so much, we think they are justified. Two layers that we have under fighting climate change. The first flashpoint was on actively combating climate change. They basically told you like, we will be able to fight climate change because we're too busy giving reparations. 4 responses here. First, their model doesn't solve. They're like, we're going to invest in green tech. First, you don't have a lot of political capital in these developed countries when you see a rise of right-wing populism and voters a lot don't want their energy prices to rise. Second, let's just take a note of their model. They said we're going to suddenly export this green technology. So you're going to have these businesses create green technology and you think these developed countries are suddenly going to just give away this green technology to developing countries removing any profit incentives. Rather, even if it takes ties ground, a more realistic scenario is that these developed countries then sell the green technology to developing countries. Why is that wrong? It's like stealing somebody's shoes and then reselling those shoes to that same person. It's double damage here. Second, they said that MEDCs will be effective at fighting climate change. Yes, we do agree that corporations in developed countries have made up the most of emissions historically. However, let's look at happening right now. Globally, 63% of the pollution is being caused by LEDCs because they're in the middle of industrialization and the developed countries are past industrialization. They don't solve for anything. Third, let me give you incentives for why developing countries are able to invest. Because we're developed countries sat under westernized thrones of morality and they're just starting to fight a decades-long problem. Or you look paternalistic of them to say, all these countries that are super corrupt are not going to invest. Let me give you some statistics here. For example, Argentina in recent years has increased investment in renewable energy by 777%. Mexico, 810%. Chile, 55%. Egypt, 495%. At least these dictators know what's better to do on an existential crisis than these people of westernized countries. You do see an incentive. Fourth and finally, Elise told you in our third substantive that you get more action on developed countries even though they don't make up the majority of pollution that's happening right now. Why is this true? Because if they continue to pollute around the world, they're going to be forced to deal with the effects, and they're also going to be forced to deal more reparations to these developing countries who continue to be hurt. When you put financial burden on them, when you make them feel the effects of their damages to developing countries, they have an exact incentive to actually fight climate change. Next layer under this is on mitigating the effects. This was never engaged with by opposition. Because what's a characterization of climate change right now? Again, you don't literally just stop climate change immediately. Pollution, the CO2 that you release in the atmosphere, often takes decades or hundreds of years to actually come into play and see the disastrous effects. So what does that mean if you don't provide anything mitigating the effects in these developing countries? It's gonna be like I steal your computer, but I'm going to try to stop stealing your computer, and in 50 years when I finally do, I'm going to give you back your computer which you missed for so long. We think at the point at which that happens, you're failing to actually help these developing countries. For example, in India's capital, New Delhi, spending one day in the capital was akin to smoking over 20 packs of cigarettes. Islands are literally going underwater. Heat strokes are killing thousands of people, and climate change is dealing its disastrous effects. It's only on side proposition that you get real accountability, principled accountability, and more fight against climate change when you take this phase.
I thank the speaker and I invite the third speaker to continue for opposition.
proposition's case is pretty well summed up in that analogy we heard at the bottom of Miles' speech. What did he tell you? He told you that our side was like stealing a computer and then telling you that we're going to give you back a new computer 50 years from now. But what does their side actually look like? Their side looks like destroying your computer and then saying, don't worry, I'll give you money to buy a new one, but I'm going to breathe over your shoulder and tell you which ones I think are the prettiest. Instead of the comparative on our side, buying a computer that we really know works, maybe a MacBook over a PC, and giving that computer to that developing country in the first place. That analogy is actually a reason why you're supposed to vote for side opposition. In this speech, a couple of things. First, we're going to be analyzing a few themes to really clarify and crystallize this ground. The first theme is on the idea of addressing climate change, and the second theme is on the idea of the principle of reparations. But first, let's analyze what happens and which side best fully addresses climate change. The thesis of their case is to give money to LEDCs from MEDCs, but then they tell you that MEDCs in the Proposition 1 create over 70% of global climate emissions. What then are the comparative stances? They tell you that somehow, through this really long link story, you're going to be able to convince MEDCs to stop spending money on climate change and to start doing things like green technology with incentivizing that thing. Abby thoroughly refuted this argument. We told you no, because political capital is finite. Countries have to spend money somewhere, and they don't want to spend it in other places, especially considering that those countries are already devoting so much money to reparations. They do not have the incentive to continue spending money on green technology because they feel as though they've already met the burden. That was the argument of complacency that we gave you. But additionally, whenever you look to side proposition, they prove this for us. Listen carefully to the Proposition 3's intro. He told you that these countries, for far too long, have never had the interests of these less economically developed countries at heart, will never do anything to structurally stop the types of pollutions that they're doing. We would tell you, in that instance, that their side is monumentally worse. Why? Not only because those countries are not directly doing anything to fix climate change, but secondarily, because they aren't even holding corporations, the creator of that pollution, accountable. So how then are you going to disincentivize the creation of more climate change in the future if you aren't holding the actors that created it accountable? You're basically giving them a slap on the wrist and saying, hey, we'd like it if you do things better. The government has the possibility to change this, but they are not doing it under the proposition rules. Additionally, what does the proposition world look like? Miles and Elise repeat this narrative that you're just going to be able to do things like building dikes, building green technology, and that no possibility of instability or corruption is going to be able to assuage this. Here's the problem. Abby gave you structural analysis about the nature of corrupt politicians, or even politicians in developing countries that have finite resources and don't know how to use them. They want to stay in power because they believe they can benefit their country or they want to benefit of it. What do they do then? They do things to keep their constituency happy. This means doing things that are tangentially related to climate change, technically allowed under their side of the house. For example, spending more money on giving cheaper electricity to people without actually creating sustainable, long-term technology that is going to be beneficial in the long term. Miles can list some statistics about why these countries aren't going to be corrupt. That does not engage with the warrant we gave you about why these countries structurally are not going to be able to do this. But look, even if you don't buy any of the analysis that I just gave you, the reason that proposition loses this debate is because their entire case about addressing climate change relies on a risk of their impacts occurring. Our model is certain that we are going to be able to give money to green technology, give money to these infrastructure for refugee resettlement. We get a new response in the Proposition 3 about, no, we're not sure that you have the political capital to do that. First of all, we think it's a bit too late that your first model attack comes in the Proposition 3. But second of all, we think reasonably, if you have the political capital both to enact these reparations and to suddenly have more political capital to create green technology and MEDCs in the future, certainly we have enough political capital to enact these green in the status quo. Why is our world necessarily better? A few reasons. First of all, we create green infrastructure both within MEDCs and within LEDCs. This literally looks like unilaterally combining all of the funds it takes to invest in green technology and then doing something that makes it so that you can develop the best type of green technology and distribute it more widely. This was the analysis that Abby gave you whenever she told you we were going to use the funds better. But secondly, you were able to help climate change refugees. They try to get us in like this cute little model quibble about what our side looks like. That, oh, you're just giving money to refugees, therefore it's reparations. No, we told you that that money can be used as resettlement. It can be used to build infrastructure. What it doesn't do is go through a secondary government with an uncertain decision of whether or not that's going to go to its people. Their principle rests on the idea, as Miles this argument. Because the purpose of reparations is a means of addressing victim suffering. We do that considering we get back to the citizens of LEDCs substantially better than they do. But second, it supersedes any political considerations. So if you're at all confused about the nature of the different countries, you can be 100% certain that our impacts will materialize. Let's move on to the second theme, which is about the principle of reparations. Before that, sure.
So your model is, let's just say that they do create this green tech. Your model is that these more developed countries create green tech and then sell it to lower developed countries. This is neo-imperialism at its finest.
Okay, that is not our model. Do not misconstrue our model. In Opposition 1, we told you about the creation and distribution of green technology that exists both within MEDCs and outside in LEDCs. It doesn't make sense for us to defend a model where like MEDCs create green tech and then sell it to LEDCs. That's literally probably like the status quo. That being said, let's analyze the second argument, which is the principle of reparations. Let's do a good faith argument and assume that they can offer conditional reparations as a legitimate means of reparations. Why then do they still lose this round? The principle of reparations is that you A, give that money back to the victims, and B, you hold the actor that committed those abuses accountable. The problem with proposition is that they voluntarily chose in the first proposition speech to tax consumers. Elise and Miles both try to work around this by saying, oh no, consumers are complicit in that abuse, therefore, we should tax them as well as the sole source of this revenue for reparations. First of all, we told you that consumers are not complicit because they had, in some instances, no alternatives. If you live in a community that is extremely poor, you do not have the ability to say, no, I don't want to shop at Walmart, I want to go shop at Whole Foods because they're more sustainable in the way that they source green technology. They respond to this by saying, no, everything's interconnected. We say, okay, sure, corporations and consumers are interconnected, but reparations is about holding the most direct person accountable. Whenever they give you this example about slave owners and holding those people accountable, we would tell you, yes, the person you hold accountable for reparations is the slave owner, not the people who sat back and watched. Even if they did not do things actively in their power to combat that, we would tell you that that is what the principle of reparations necessarily dictates. Why does this argument actually win us round? Because I've just proven to you that reparations are an unjust enforcement of principle in this specific scenario. This necessarily means that enforcing an unjust law has practical consequences. Abby told you about the idea of losing out on political capital with other big countries. But know that this crucially has long-term impacts. Let's dig a little deeper. This necessarily means that if you want to have MEDCs doing things like, resettle and climate change refugees, that is less likely to occur structurally because MEDCs feel as though they're being unfairly taxed for a thing that they did not commit, or consumers, the popular support, feel as though they're being unfairly tried. Look, this debate is extremely clear. We address the problem of climate change better, which means that there are less people to give reparations to in the future. We short-circuit all of their impacts and create none of the harms. Very, very proud to oppose.
Speaker for her fine speech. Now I invite the reply speakers to conclude this debate. Firstly, opposition reply.
Side proposition might be sitting comfortably in their ivory tower of morality, but I'm beginning to wonder what they're going to start doing when that ivory tower starts taking on water. Because even though they might have a moral stance, ultimately, they fail at solving the problem in any way. Over the course of this speech, I'll first briefly address framework before going over the basic analysis as to how we won. But first with the framing. We on side opposition believe they fundamentally misconstrue what reparations are. Reparations are a moral tool, not a pragmatic tool. If you're a slave owner who just released a slave and you give reparations to them, you don't have the right to say, oh, but you only get access to these reparations if you go west. You can't stay here. No. If you're giving reparations to someone, you're giving them the resources to use them as they please. With this in itself, their argument falls. Let's understand why by analyzing their world and later on going on to analyze ours. Starting with what it means to have reparations with zero strings attached. Already in all three of their speeches, they seem to have conceded that if reparations don't have strings attached, that means that inevitably they won't be used for the right purposes. That means already their argument fails. But let's take them at their best case scenario. Even if these people are interested in using the money for good, if you are a dictator, your concerns are short-term stability. That's something that Abby does a really good job of analyzing. So you're not going to prepare for a world in 40 years where climate change might be problematic for the entire world. You're going to better your people's scenario right now so they keep on keeping you in power and the military doesn't have a coup. But you know what? Let's take them at their best case scenario and pretend that these dictators are fabulous people. Even then, there's a huge problem because these small countries lack the economic capabilities to invest in green technology at this scale. Now, Miles might not have taken AP Econ, but he needs to understand that the United States and other more economically developed countries have an absolute advantage when it comes to the development of green technology. This means we can produce more solar panels, more dams, and more wind turbines at a cheaper cost. That means that if you really want to solve climate change, you're going to vote opposition. But you know what? Let's take them at their best case scenario and finally say that everything happens, they have a magic genie that solves all their industrial problems. Even then, you're only solving for 25% of the problem. Because as we all concede in all of our speeches, these less economically developed nations only have 25% of emissions. The other 75% are more economically developed countries. That means that they don't solve. Peel their case back layer by layer and I can't find any solvency. Looking for solvency and come over to the opposition case. In our world, we do a few things. First of all, analyzing the comparative, we solve the underlying problems. Because when you have underlying issues in climate change, what really reparations means is solving that climate change. We do this in a few ways. First of all, we most efficiently use funds to solve for climate change by investing in effective green technology. The United States and other developed nations have better technology, better solar panels, and more industrial capabilities. We're the only ones that can end up solving the problem. Second, we have to understand that we have more economic capabilities and more tools to use against this. We have, even if you don't buy any of our model, understand that the 1.7 trillion that we would put into reparations by 2050 is better used to fund things like cap and trade or like a way to fund a carbon tax, which would better solve the issues of climate change. Once again, they don't have any solvency. This is where it's really important to go back to what Un tells you in her third speech. The only thing that side proposition boasts is a minute risk of offense. 100,000 stars have to align in just the right way for them to access any of their impacts. But the developed world is already taking notice of climate change. European countries are already trying to solve it, and hopefully as of the 2020 elections, countries like the United States will follow. Only through this, in countries that have the capabilities to solve climate change, can we actually go for a problem in the future. Don't stay in an ivory tower that's going to say, come over to the opposition and solve climate change.
I thank the speaker for his fine speech, and I invite the reply speaker to conclude from the side of proposition.
At the beginning of the opposition run, we were told that green technology was going to be exported to different nations. And then, as a clarification, in the opposition 3, we heard, no, we're just sharing the green technology with the rest of the world. At that point, we think this debate has come down to either giving these developing nations green technology or giving them the money to develop their own green technology. The opposition has crossed the house. Two main things to analyze in this speech. First, are reparations justified? Second, what's the comparative? First of all, are reparations justified? We told you, yes, they are, and they can be conditional. We told you that the conditions were very clearly either to combat climate change or to mitigate the impacts. The response we heard was just that it can't be conditional. We told you, Miles gave you in his 3, a lot of analysis as to why they actually could be. This is the best mechanism to ensure that the people who are hurt because of the impacts of climate change are actually helped. The government is just the middleman. The conditions make sure that these reparations are actually fulfilled. At that point, we think that even if you take the opposition on their best ground, say that they can't be conditional because of the definition of reparations, we also gave you a lot of incentive analysis throughout all 3 speeches about why even dictators have the incentive to invest in green technology in the first place. We told you they want to preserve long-term stability because they're going to be in power for a large amount of time, but also they want to ensure long-term economic stability for their country. That looks like the agriculture industry or rising droughts. But even if you use Abby's window analogy against them, then you look at the fact that if your window isn't there anymore, you're likely to use the money to invest back in a window. Why? Because it rains. When it rains, you're going to get water in your house. Why is this the same? Because if you don't invest in green technology, when it floods, your house is going underwater. We think at that point it is justified to tax the consumer, first because they're still a bystander, second because we told you that corporations were a part of this, they will be taxed at the correct part of the tax bracket, but then also, even on that grounds, if you are a bystander, you're still principally involved, it measures up to that justification. Second, what is the comparative? We think that the opposition makes a mistake when they rely on MEDCs actually deciding to take action, because that is the opposition model. We told you there were 3 structural reasons why developed nations weren't going to take action. First, they don't face the immediate impacts of climate change in the first place. Second, they thrive on harmful industries like exporting oil. And third, they lack urgency to actually combat this problem. That's not going to work. Climate change is imminent. Conversely, Miles gave you a lot of analysis as to how in the status quo, developing countries are quickly investing in climate change because they actually do see the impacts. Miles told you that yes, the majority in the status quo of this contribution to climate change does come from LDCs. That's why we should prioritize their ability to get access to things to combat climate change. He gave you statistics like Mexico and Argentina increasing their investment in green technology by around 800%. That's phenomenally more than anything the MEDCs are doing in the status quo. But also note, if you want the best incentive analysis for the MEDCs actually to take some kind of action, it's if the people are having to face the repercussions of this climate change work in the first place. First, because consumers are not going to put a profit incentive on the companies to produce the material that doesn't hurt the climate as much. But second, people in politics have people pushing them to try and combat climate change because the consumers have to pay taxes. You can use that analysis against the opposition as well. But fine, let's say that these MEDCs decide to completely change their stance on what currently is their path toward fighting climate change. We think even to that extent, you're going to prefer the proposition because we're giving these LDCs the ability to invest in technology to produce their own green technology. They're no longer dependent on these developed countries. At the end of the day, we showed you the principal justification and why it is more likely that we're going to combat climate change when we give these developing countries the chance and the money that they deserve.
Speaker for the final speech. I thank the debaters for this debate. You may now shake your hands and judges will leave the room for a few seconds, minutes, so that we can reach the decision.
So you gotta do it right.
Here, I need to take a picture with each of you with this, so I have pictures like the teams. So, unsteam over here, please.
I remember reading
Okay. Unsteam, I'm going to take with both eyes because I'm going to have to shoot your email. Okay. You don't know as well. This way, I live in across town. Yeah, it doesn't look good.
like reality TV.
Okay, Elise, your team over here.
We changed.
My friend said she's really. Oh, same. Okay.
Oh, yeah.
Oh, God.